auditorium, and it's 2 o'clock, so I'll start. Welcome, everybody, to the National Association of Scholars' latest entry in the Great American Literature webinar series. Today, we're discussing F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Now, I am David Randall, Director of Research at the National Association of Scholars, your moderator, and I am delighted to have 4 speakers today, whom I will describe briefly. More of their works, their books, will be appearing in the chat button below. This will include Amazon links to where you can buy their collected works. We encourage you to do so immediately. Get your credit cards ready. We have Dr. William Blazek, who is a professor of American literature and modern culture at Liverpool Hope University and serves as vice president of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Society. And he edited the 2022 Oxford World Classics edition of The Beautiful and the Damned. And he's also founding co-editor of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Review. Professor Sarah Churchwell is chair in Public Understanding of the Humanities at the School of Advanced Study at the University of London. Her scholarship generally focuses on 20th and 21st century American literature. Books include The Invention of the Great Gatsby. Strangely enough, that she is a specialist. Dr. Lee Oser is professor in the Department of English at the College of the Holy Cross. He is also a former president of the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers. Dr. Oser is the author of several novels and nonfiction works, including The Return of Christian Humanism, Chesterton, Eliot, Tolkien, and the Romance of History, The Ethics of Modernism, Moral Ideas, and Yeats, Eliot, Joyce, Woolf, and Beckett. And the fourth of our lecturers is Professor Nicolas Tredell, an extramural lecturer in literature at the University of Sussex, who has served as consultant editor of the Reader's Guides to Essential Criticism series. Works include the dynamics of hope, analyzing tech, excuse me, I'm getting the semicolon wrong, analyzing texts, The Great Gatsby and Tinder is the Night, and The Great Gatsby, a Continuum Reader's Guide. So having said all that, each of our speakers, in alphabetical order by last name, is going to speak for about 12 to 14 minutes. This will be followed by a Q&A where you, the audience, put in your questions in the chat or the Q&A buttons. I then pass them on, or they're read by the speakers, or they chat with each other. But if I read questions, I simply select based on what I think will make for a fun conversation, not chronological. If any of your questions are left unanswered, don't worry. Send me an email, randall@nas.org, RANDALL, @nas.org. Afterwards, I will forward your questions to the speakers so they can have the option to respond to you. And don't worry if you have to leave in the middle. We're going to have this recorded on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours. It'll be available in perpetuity. And with that delightful thought waiting for us, Professor Blazek, may I ask you to speak first?
Well, welcome everyone to our viewers and listeners to this series on the great American novel. And I don't want to undermine your expectations here, but I do have some apprehensions about the idea of a great American novel. We know that The Great Gatsby, Americans especially will know that Gatsby often tops surveys about being the great American novel, and perhaps at least in the 20th century anyway. But of course, that idea of greatness, making things great, has some political overtones, perhaps unfortunate ones these days. And the idea of a great American novel is also quite subjective, isn't it? Maybe that means just a novel that people find worth rereading. And one could make a case that Tender is the Night is actually Fitzgerald's greatest novel, more ambitious in scope and more complex in different ways. But if we focus on The Great Gatsby, it does have some advantages as a great American novel. For one thing, it's short length, as proven by the elevator repair service production of Gats, which they managed to have a long interval and still have the whole text read in less than 8 hours. And of course, it has great in the title too. So that's another advantage it has for topping those polls. But I want to talk not so much about some of the more common themes and ideas in the novel about the American dream, etc., but think about what makes this a very important novel. And partly that's to do with the technique of the novel, and also had to do with this theme I'd like to explore, the theme of time in the novel. In terms of technique, the early review by the influential critic H.L. Mencken, he called the novel, in terms of its character and action, he said it was no more than a glorified anecdote. But he also then admired what he called the charm and beauty of its writing. And so it's that stylistic virtuosity, I think, that we especially admire in this novel. And we can trace some reasons for that besides the skill, of perhaps innate in some ways, skills of the novelist. There's also the influence of Joseph Conrad, I think, especially ideas about tone and color in the text, and how that creates what Conrad called the perfect blending of form and substance. And I think that was very, very important for Fitzgerald in this. And then another influence was a more recent one in the writing of the novel itself. In the summer of 1924, Fitzgerald is in Europe, and he's encountering in Paris and on the Riviera European and American modernists, not just in writing, but across the arts. So he's meeting Picasso and Cocteau, Hemingway, and Archibald MacLeish too. And so he's modernizing himself really through cross-fertilization of ideas about what makes things different, how to change form to fit the modern age, this machine age, and that the combination of things to do with the style of both a kind of lyric romanticism and the range, the sheer range of styles that this text includes. So from a kind of lush lyrical romanticism, especially he's using hyperbole a great deal, vivid, really harsh realism, especially in the death of Myrtle Wilson. There's aspects of surrealism in different parts of the text, especially the pictures of El Greco and the scene after the party at Myrtle Wilson's apartment. And then there's this high modernism too, with its ambiguities and ironies as well. So we have to appreciate that side of things, first of all. But then in terms of how he puts the substance into the blending of form and substance, we can look at the idea of time, I think. So Gatsby famously, of course, replies to Nick Carraway, the narrator's comment that you can't repeat the past. And Gatsby replies, "Can't repeat the past? Why, of course you can!" Exclamation mark. And when you're reading the text, you realize that you can repeat the past, or at least you can recreate it through the narrative itself, this retrospective narrative of memory and how he's reformulating it through writing. And it's that narrative retelling, we could say, that makes Gatsby great. As Nick, I think, trying to understand not just Gatsby, but understand himself, explain to himself what is called in the text at different times the colossal vitality of Gatsby's illusion, and the heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, the extraordinary gift for hope and a romantic readiness. And we could relate that, I think, that sense of what Gatsby has that Nick doesn't have, at least at the start of the novel, that he's searching for in himself, back to, I think, their shared experience in the First World War. Nick is one of Fitzgerald's sad young men, which is the title of the short story collection that follows The Great Gatsby. And as both of them being combat veterans, then I think they share something of that disillusionment after the war too, the promise of better life when they came back to America for these these soldiers. It didn't happen for most of them. And unlike Tom Buchanan, who, as far as we can tell, avoided military service, maybe he had bone spurs that prevented him from enlisting. And Gatsby should have had the promise for a better life and perhaps a return to that love he meets in the training camp before the war, because the army provided advancement through merit in the First War for the first time really in American history. And he could advance now so in the battlefield too, to be a major in the army, higher rank than Nick Carraway has. And perhaps also when the reading of the text is that they both suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. And so it's not just a kind of cultural malaise, but also one that affects them psychologically as well. And perhaps that may explain some ways why Gatsby believes he can repeat the past, because of the mind that is still kind of making sense of his experience in the previous decade. Well, where is time in the style of the text? Well, it's actually, you can see it in the opening paragraph of the text, the famous opening sentence. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been running over in my mind ever since. Notice the mind again there too, how it does involve the recreation of the past through memory, recapitulation of experience. But also we have here is his younger and more vulnerable years. He's thinking about his past, thinking of his father, giving advice in the present, and then also he's thinking about it ever since too. So we have past, present, and future all combining here in that opening sentence. And then throughout the text, you have other things like the train schedule, the list of guests at Gatsby's parties, which is a train schedule from 2 years before. And it's the 5th of July, so it's related to American history as well, the day after the Independence Day. And a key passage, I think, is when Daisy and Gatsby are meeting again after that gap, and they're in Nick Carraway's house. And this clock, what's called a defunct clock, is tipped off the mantelpiece by Gatsby. And he arrests its fall just before it hits the floor. But they imagine that it did hit the floor. So what is memory working for? Things actually could change the notion of reality itself. The defunct clock as well, I think, fits in with ideas about writing too, because you could argue that this is a symbol, a metaphor of the way that writing itself can't be just this linear sense of time anymore. Writing has to be something that is more convoluted, more complex, that shifts in and out of past, present, and future. And it comes in so many different ways to the text, just some small little hints about the way that not just the structure of the 9 different chapters works, but even individual sentences as well. And another example would be when Tom Buchanan has his reaction to seeing Myrtle's dead body too, and he's thinking about what's about to happen, what has happened, his history with her, how he's going to react to it, what he's going to do about that, and just this wonderful vortex of different aspects of time within just one page there. Now, those are details within the text, but I think there's another way of thinking about time in the text, and that is to do with the changes in American society too, in a larger sense, that socioeconomic conditions and the way that this solidified moneyed class is kind of building its fortress. And within that is a general sense of the immorality of the time in this post-World War I recovery period. And so there's class cultural divisions, very prescient in Fitzgerald's case, I think. And we see that in the working of time. Again, Tom Buchanan has changed a stable in his house to a garage. And so we have past and present there. Strangely, almost that he's taking the present and solidifying it back into the past again. And related to that is this sense of change in the way that if someone's excluded from that social, those social aspirations and the economic ones, then what you're left with is underground energy channels. So Tom needs Myrtle Wilson's vitality, the lower class vitality, because the upper class can't just enclose themselves. They have to actually draw upon new energy, almost like electricity channels. And they do link into that. A good example of that is that when they drive into the chapter leading to the encounter at the Plaza Hotel, he goes back in the house and gets some whiskey. So there's the bootleg liquor that he accuses, Gatsby of being, and how that doesn't fit the upper class world. So that hypocrisy there too. And I think, perhaps finally, in this point about cultural change, you have the Queensborough Bridge scene. Queensborough Bridge is a bridge that's only about 12 years old, about 1910, 1911 when it was finished. And you have here the scene where we have social movement, the democratic America on the move. And I thought I'd just read part of that passage. Famously begins, "The city seen from the Queensborough Bridge is always a city seen for the first time." We have time again. How can it be seen for the first time if you've seen it once again? "In its first wild promise of all the mystery and the beauty in the world." And then the next paragraph. "A dead man passed us in a hearse heaped with blooms, followed by 2 carriages with drawn blinds, and by more cheerful carriages for friends. The friends looked out at us with the tragic eyes and short upper lips of southeastern Europe, and I was glad that the sight of Gatsby's splendid car was included in their somber holiday. As we crossed Blackwell's Island, a limousine passed us, driven by a white chauffeur, in which sat 3 modish Negroes, 2 bucks and a girl. I laughed aloud at the yolks of their eyeballs rolled toward us in haughty rivalry. Anything can happen now that we've slid over this bridge, I thought, anything at all. Even Gatsby could happen without any particular wonder." Well, you could read this in quite different ways, as Nick Carraway reinforcing his racialist views of America, but what he sees, I think, is trying to understand that. And what Fitzgerald, I think, gives us is that sense of, as I said, a democratic America changing, transforming itself, and having to come to terms with itself as well. And that's the biggest change of time, I think. And Fitzgerald is showing us that we need to be open to that, I think, too. Now, I'd like to say a lot more about another aspect of time, the universal sense of time, the way that I think nature fits into this text, and how there's a real contrast between our earthly concerns and temporal things about living in the present versus more kind of rhythms of nature, the seasonal changes and other things that the novel includes too. But perhaps I can save that for the recap at the end. I have a passage I could point people to. Back to you then, David.
Thank you so much then. Sorry, just thought you were going on for another second. Thank you so much. Professor Churchwell, may I ask you to go next?
Of course, yeah, thanks so much. And may I say, it's as if Bill and I set up that handoff because he opened with some reservations about the phrase, the great American novel. And I'm delighted that he did, because I'm always really pleased when I'm asked to talk about The Great Gatsby as the great American novel. Because, as Bill rightly said, it is a phrase that we approach with some suspicion or some reservations, and rightly so. It begs questions about what is, as he said, what is greatness? Is greatness a measurement that we want to invest in? Is it one that we trust? What would it look like if we knew? What kinds of greatness are we talking about? In some, is it a meaningful category for thinking about art or this novel in particular? But one of the things that I like about it is that, at least in the case of the author of The Great Gatsby, it was a meaningful category, and one that he engaged with as he was writing the book. And one of my favorite instances of that is a much less well-known one that I actually dug up from the gossip columns of 1923. So Fitzgerald later said that he began drafting Gatsby in the summer of 1923. Now, he was not always a reliable witness of his own life. He drank a lot, which clouded his memory, and he wrote some of his recollections about his life long after the fact, which also, of course, will cloud your memory. So we can't take everything he said as the gospel truth, but he did say that he began this novel that was indeed important to him, and we certainly know that he began drafting it in the summer of 1923, in fact, in July 1923. As Bill said, he would write it in 1924, and of course was published in early 1925. He'd actually been thinking about it since the summer of 1922, but he didn't begin drafting it until July 1923. And that month, there was a newspaper columnist, a literary critic and book editor called Burton Rascoe, who wrote for a New York paper, who reported he had a kind of literary gossip column, and he reported in the New York Tribune in July 1923 that he had seen Scott and Zelda at a quintessential Long Island jazz cocktail party, and that during that party, Fitzgerald had showed them some card tricks, which he was famous for doing at parties. He was famous for doing some other things at parties, but that's one of the more repeatable ones. And that he also told everyone the plot of, quote, and this is Rascoe's quote from July 1923, told us the plot of the great American novel, which he is just writing, and asked me not to give it away. Now, and then Rascoe didn't give it away, which is irritating to those of us who would like to know how it might have changed from the time that Fitzgerald first started talking about it. Now, again, he was almost certainly drunk. He was at a party. He probably had his tongue in his cheek to a certain extent, but he also used that kind of mocking self-deprecation, I think, pretty clearly to cover up the depth of his own aspirational feelings about his own work, particularly as it developed and as it attached itself to The Great Gatsby. He was writing letters as he was finishing it, where he kind of pretended to be joking, but you can tell from the tone that he also kind of means it, to his editor and to his friends, saying, I think my novel is the greatest American novel ever written, or about the best American novel ever written. And it was a theme that he came back to. Now, as we read those letters, we sometimes, as I say, we may want to ask ourselves, how ironic is he being? Is he teasing? Is he joking? But it's there. It's at the very minimum, we have to admit that it's a preoccupation in the way that he talks about this novel, as he's writing it before it has even come out. So that doesn't mean we have to accept that he pulled it off either. It doesn't mean it is the great American novel or even a great American novel, but that it is a pertinent category for us in terms of framing how we approach the novel, if only because of his aspirations for it. Now, I like that as a way of, as I say, kind of framing the novel, because Gatsby is an aspirational novel in every sense. It's an aspirational novel in terms of Fitzgerald's aesthetic aspirations for it, his commercial aspirations for it, but also because it's a book about aspiration, right? It's obviously about aspiration. It's about Jay Gatsby's aspirations. It's about American society's aspirations. And very importantly, therefore, it's about the failure of those aspirations. It's about the ways in which those aspirations are not met. So Fitzgerald is really measuring reality against the ideal in every aspect of the book's composition and its content. That kind of key question, or the key exploration of the limits between the difference between the real and the ideal, is fundamentally what the book is about. I mean, it's about other things too, but that's a fundamental core issue that the book is about, both in terms of human individual dreams like Jay Gatsby's and national utopian dreams of creating an ideal society, or of even something bigger than that, a dream that goes beyond what a society might look like, that Fitzgerald points to at the end of the novel, a kind of infinite dream of human wonder. And what might that look like if we didn't attach it to society? What might we be dreaming of? And these ideas are, of course, at least loosely associated with transcendentalism in the American tradition of philosophy that itself measured the real by its relationship to the ideal, and the sense that the individual mind transcending reality is what gives us that philosophy, and that. I'm not going to get into transcendentalism. Don't worry, I'm not going to go off onto Emerson. But of course, Fitzgerald was raised in an Emersonian tradition, a great man Emersonian tradition of the individual American as a great man and of striving as a great American ambition. And the novel again comes back to the limits of Jay Gatsby as that kind of Emersonian aspirational figure, a representative man. How representative is he? Should we aspire to be like Jay Gatsby? Is he actually an object lesson in what not to do? And of course, it's a novel about how his dreams keep exceeding his reality and the reality of the nation into which he was born. Now, that idea of exceeding your own reality or your ideals being bigger than the world can accommodate or than your own abilities can accommodate, again, is kind of baked into the way that Fitzgerald approached the novel. He told his editor, Max Perkins, that he wasn't prepared to deliver it until it represented the very best of which he was capable. And then he added, or as I sometimes like to think, something better than I am capable of. Which I think is such a wonderful phrase for aspirationalism itself. The idea that you could, because it's an oxymoron, right? You can't, by definition, you can't do anything better than you're capable of. But that it's the idea of man's reach exceeding his grasp, but saying that by doing so, you can actually become capable of more than you are capable of. And that paradox is built into how he approached the novel. Another way of putting that is that it's asking, can we will our way beyond our own capacity? And of course, that, I'm going to bring in one more philosopher. I don't think I'm going to bring in any others. We'll see where my mind goes, but is a Nietzschean idea, right? What Nietzsche famously called the will to power. And Fitzgerald was reading Nietzsche when he was thinking about the novel, was certainly influenced by those ideas. We know that. Gatsby's will to power is also, it's negative in lots of ways, not just because it fails, but one of those is that it's not a little narcissistic. He won't accept that Daisy might love anyone but him. He never shows any interest in anyone but himself and Daisy, and her as a kind of extension of him. I often say, and I tend to piss people off mightily when I say so, but I stand by it, is that in another novel, Gatsby would be a stalker. Daisy rejects him and he will not take no for an answer. And he buys the closest house to her that he can get, and he tries to get to her parties, and he's crashing her house, and he's determined for it. He's a stalker. In another movie, he would be the guy with that den of photos of Daisy. And of course, he does have his scrapbooks of Daisy, and he shows them to her, here are all the pictures, all the clippings that I've kept of you. He is obsessed with her. And so, without wanting to take that idea too far, I think the point that I want to make here is about the way that it leads to narcissism and solipsism, and that's one of the failures of that kind of will to power model. So the desire to push through to the ideal at what cost, and who gets to decide what the ideal looks like, which again takes us back to Bill's initial question about how do we define greatness, and should we be suspicious of the category itself. That said, Fitzgerald also makes clear that Gatsby is an idealist who's been corrupted by a cynical world that is less than his ambitions, and that he's pinned what could be magnificent dreams to the inadequate possibilities of his very commercial, materialistic society. And when we talk about the novel as a novel of the American dream, I take it that that's broadly the themes that we tend to be talking about. This is a novel about how America could have been better than it is, but it's corrupted by this material, notions of material success, and by a preoccupation with upward social mobility. And so, although Nick says that Gatsby is redeemed by his idealism does not redeem his society. Instead, that society destroys him. He falls into the gap between the ideal and the real, if you like. The way I would put it is using Fitzgerald's own language, though, which is that he smashes into the barrier between reality and his dreams. And he breaks up, as Fitzgerald says, like glass against the hard malice of Tom Buchanan's power. And that's what marks the absolute limit of the American dream of self-invention, of upward social mobility, is the obdurate limits of other people's power. It's worth saying that although we talk about this novel as the quintessential novel of the American dream, that phrase never appears in the novel, as I'm sure most of you have noticed, but if not, it's worth paying attention to that. It was not popularized as an expression until 1931, 6 years after the novel came out. so I find that there are kind of anachronisms that we import into the novel and received wisdoms. And I want to wind up by suggesting some of the ways in which we might want to try to push back against some of those. First of all, increasingly, I find that as I talk to people about the novel, that they don't see it as a novel about the failure or the limits of the American dream, but just as a pretty straightforward celebration of the American dream. I think that idea is fairly influenced by Baz Luhrmann's film, which is almost a decade old now, hard to imagine for those of us who remember coming up, but it was 2013. That just seems to see wealth as a measure of the success of the American dream. And they kind of think, well, Gatsby, embodies the American dream because he got rich and he has a big house. And then, I always have to point out as a kind of killjoy, like in my Gatsby's a stalker mode, I also point out the fact that he ends up betrayed and abandoned by the woman he loves. He doesn't get anything that he actually wants, and he ends up dead in a swimming pool. So if we're thinking about the American dream as a dream of success, then it has to matter that it ends in abject failure. If that's what you think we're talking about, then we have to notice the role of failure in the novel. I've got an eye on time, so I'm just going to go to the points I wanted to make at the end, which is that there's one other commonplace I want to challenge, and then I'll wind up, which is that we also talk now sometimes about the ways in which Gatsby's first readers, there's again a kind of commonplace that Fitzgerald's first readers didn't understand Gatsby at all, and that's why it was a comparative commercial failure. It was not a massive commercial failure. It didn't bomb, but it didn't make anything like the money that he hoped it would make. It didn't have those sales, and so it didn't meet his aspirations and his ambitions. But it got actually decent reviews. But we have this belief that they fundamentally misunderstood it. That's partly because Fitzgerald said that nobody understood it, which is a good reason for thinking that he thought that nobody understood it. But it's also, I think, because of a certain tendency that we have to condescend to the past and to assume that we figured things out, that they were too naive or too foolish or too unsophisticated a reader to see, or they didn't understand society well enough. But actually, if you go back and read the original reviews of the novel, you see that the one thing that they did consistently see was that it was a novel about social exclusion and material corruption. They totally got that part. They didn't use the phrase American dream because, as I said, it wasn't a catchphrase yet. But they talked about that aspect pretty regularly, pretty consistently. So they certainly saw that it was about that. But I want to bring back, I've been kind of, some of these themes can be called a little bit old fashioned maybe, but I think that if we push back against what we think those phrases mean and start to ask different questions about how the novel works, we can start to think, as Bill was encouraging us to do, and as I'd like to do, as I say, to re-examine these questions about where it sits in relationship to greatness, where it sits in relationship to the ideas about reality and the ideal. So I would encourage us to think, although I was asked to speak to you about its ideas about the American dream, about its position as a great American novel, I would certainly encourage us to think beyond what it has to say about the American dream, as well as beyond how we might think of it as a novel of the American dream, as well as what it may or may not have to say about it. Or, to put it differently, which American dream we're talking about and why we're talking about that American dream. Because after all, there are lots of dreams about America. But I do think that The Great Gatsby is fundamentally, as a novel, it embodies a dream about America. And as such, for me, it certainly remains one of our most magnificent, and we can debate its greatness as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Lovely to hear that. Now I'll go on to Professor Oser.
Well, thank you for having me, David, and thank you to William and Sarah for those marvelous presentations. And I do mean to scare you, because I will talk a little bit about Emerson. And in fact, I'm going to read a bit from a paper, a short paper, because I'm concerned with The Great Gatsby as a work of literature and the literary influences on Fitzgerald. So my paper is called Gatsby's Ancestry. It is brief. By Gatsby's ancestry, I do not mean that shiftless couple, Mr. and Mrs. Gatz. I have in mind, rather, Fitzgerald, the literary artist, and his literary ancestors, the writers who spark his genius. Before saying who they are, I want first to say that I would classify Fitzgerald above all other considerations as a great stylist. He is a lyric writer with a magical gift for phrasing, for matching the right noun with the right adjective, for making superb verb choices, for delivering a tightly controlled syntax and a masterful display of artistic perfection. He is not a novelist of ideas. He is to some extent a moralist, but his moralism is clunky, and if it does not go against the grain of his genius, nonetheless, we can say that his moralism complements his style like one of those unexpected combinations in cookery, like peanut sauce on a steak. I am unpersuaded, for instance, by the voice that begins the novel. Here is page 1, paragraph 2, the advice of Nick's father. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages you've had. This fatherly finger wagging is at odds with the high wire performance that follows. Did Tom Buchanan's father dole out similarly gratuitous advice? How about the father of railroad tycoon James J. Hill? Where did this awful folksy just remember come from? Not Hamlet, that's for sure. Nor does it possess the gravitas of judge not lest ye be judged. The note is wrong, bland, bourgeois, and genteel. It signals that the Carraways know the right people. Their Midwest is not that of Mark Twain or Theodore Dreiser. It is a Midwest of the genteel tradition, where art does not go very deep and truisms suppress the murk of reality. Fitzgerald was an original genius, but Nick Haraway is a moral hack. If the style is the man, it's a good thing the novel wasn't named after its slightly wooden narrator, a man who is in no sense great, for it is really Gatsby who opens the gates of Fitzgerald's genius. This brings us to the question at hand, the question of Fitzgerald's literary ancestors. I want to single out 3, though this short list in itself hardly constitutes an original contribution to scholarship. The writers I have in mind make numerous appearances in Fitzgerald's published letters. Fitzgerald scholars have long been aware of their importance. They are the English Romantic poet John Keats, 1795 to 1821, the American-born English modernist poet T.S. Eliot, 1888 to 1965, and the Russian-born English writer of Polish extraction, Joseph Conrad, 1857 to 1924. I'll start with Eliot, who was Fitzgerald's older contemporary. Fitzgerald thought of him as a great man. That's in the letters. After Eliot had written on New Year's Eve 1925 to express his excitement over the Great Gatsby, Fitzgerald wrote back from Paris acknowledging the poet's direct influence on several paragraphs in his novel. One might go so far as to say, with no prejudice against Fitzgerald, that the Great Gatsby owes its fashionable essence to Eliot's modernist poetry. The hollow banter that finds its way through the mouths of Fitzgerald's bored and disillusioned socialites is one aspect of Eliot's many-layered influence. "What'll we do with ourselves this afternoon?" cried Daisy. "What shall I do now? What shall I do?" cries the lady of situations in the wasteland. Nick wears white flannels like J. Alfred Prufrock. Young clerks in the dusk among throbbing taxi cabs harkens back both to Prufrock and to the wasteland. George and Myrtle Wilson inhabit a veritable wasteland, a valley of ashes and spasms of bleak dust, surveilled not by T.S. Eliot, but by the faceless eyes of Wilson's bespectacled god, T.J. Eckelberg. We recognize the year 1922 as the year of Gatsby's death, of Nick's fling with Jordan Baker, and of the Buchanan's abrupt removal from East Egg. It was also the year when The Wasteland first appeared, as well as James Joyce's famous novel, Ulysses. For that reason, 1922 is sometimes referred to as modernism's annus mirabilis, its miraculous year. I turn now to the Romantic poet John Keats. Fitzgerald took the title of his last complete novel, Tender is the Night, from Keats's 1819 poem, Ode to a Nightingale. Keats wrote a number of celebrated odes during his short life. The Ode to a Nightingale is typical in its rendering of sensuous detail and its imaginative conception. In both respects, the poem instantiates the creative power that Keats called negative capability, which he described in an 1818 letter as a quality that goes, quote, to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. Keats goes on to say that negative capability, quote, perhaps takes us no further than this, that with a great poet, the sense of beauty overcomes every other consideration, or rather obliterates all consideration, end quote. The gist of the matter is that such a great poet disappears into his or her imaginative vision. Keats's negative capability distinguishes him from the egotistical sublime of Wordsworth, whose greatness is inseparable from his ego, from himself, and from his individual being. As a great stylist, Fitzgerald possesses negative capability in spades. You can hear beauties overcoming other considerations in one of the novel's landmark sentences. Quote, the lawn started at the beach and ran toward the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walks and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the side in bright vines as though from the momentum of its run. Reading this passage, we gladly surrender the burden of our self-consciousness to sensuous detail and playful imaginative intensity. Gatsby, on the other hand, is a poet of the egotistical sublime, which crossed the Atlantic in the 1830s in the form of Wordsworth's young admirer, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Nick gives us Gatsby's version of the egotistical sublime, quote, his heart beat faster and faster as Daisy's white face came up to his own. He knew that when he kissed this girl and forever wed his unutterable visions to her perishable breath, his mind would never romp again like the mind of God. Gatsby's sublime has an unfortunate tendency to plummet into bathos. There is something theatrical and meretricious about it. For instance, in Gatsby's idea of climbing a ladder to the stars and gulping, quote, down the incomparable milk of wonder, end quote, the sensuous detail has been supplanted by pseudo-poetic abstraction. And yet, this is where the real moral action of the novel takes place, not in Nick's genteel hand-wringing, but in the artistic and spiritual struggle of Nick's/Fitzgerald's negative capability over and against the Gnostic egotism of Gatsby. The stylized America of the Great Gatsby emerges from the creative amalgamation of Keats's Fairylands Forlorn and Eliot's Wasteland. The vision of an original America, which Fitzgerald broaches at the end of his novel, is something that is now, in Keats's keyword, forlorn. Forlorn, the very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my sole self. We can compare this to Fitzgerald's sublime valediction, quote, for a transitory enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired. Face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. Nick, as we know, goes on to connect this capacity for wonder to Gatsby. And as I sat there brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Gatsby's dock. This phrasing is less gaudy than, quote, the incomparable milk of wonder. It is the difference between the genius's inspiration and the epigons, though the two forms of inspiration are surely related. Nick, at the end of his metropolitan epic, is left in the position of Eliot's narrator at the end of The Wasteland. I sat upon the shore fishing, with the arid plain behind me. Shall I at least set my lands in order? The synthesis of Keats and Eliot is also felt when we recall another of Fitzgerald's sources, Keats's sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer. Because it makes explicit the link between literature and geography that I'm trying to illuminate here, I'd like to read Keats's sonnet in full, 14 lines. On first looking into Chapman's Homer. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he'd stared at the Pacific and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. The moment when Cortez, it should actually be Balboa incidentally, encounters the Pacific Ocean, returns us to the, quote, transitory enchanted moment man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. But in terms of literary geography, let us note Fitzgerald's words in his 1926 letter to Eliot, quote, "One day Edmund Wilson phoned me that he had the dial proofs of a new long poem. I'll never forget that afternoon. Since first I read Youth, I'd had no such elation." If Keats gave Fitzgerald the clue to a lost Eden of the imagination, it was Eliot who gave him the clue to this Eden in its fallen condition, to this modern paradise lost. The extended analogy then is that Cortez's Pacific is akin to Keats's discovery of Homer via Chapman, which are both akin to Fitzgerald's discovery of Eliot's wasteland. And let us add that this literary geographical analogy revolves around the center of artistic inspiration. I come now to the third of Gatsby's ancestors, the novelist Joseph Conrad. By a happy coincidence, and as some of you have no doubt noticed, Conrad has already returned, as it were of his own accord, through Fitzgerald's reference to youth in his letter to Eliot. I'm going to close my window because the lawnmower is out there. This will take me 10 seconds. I remember Jeffrey Hill reading at Yale 25 years ago and becoming very upset at the radiators. Well, I wasn't upset, but I thought it would be convenient to close the window. I come now to the third of Gatsby's ancestors, the novelist Joseph Conrad. By a happy coincidence, and as some of you have no doubt noticed, Conrad has already returned, as it were, of his own accord, through Fitzgerald's reference to youth in his letter to Eliot. The author of Youth and Heart of Darkness was near the end of his life when Fitzgerald, living in Great Neck, told his editor, Max Perkins, that the as yet untitled Gatsby would, quote, be a consciously artistic achievement and must depend on that, as my first books did not. Was Fitzgerald conscious of the respective roles of Keats and Eliot in his novel? No doubt he was. On the other hand, and judging from what he says in his letter to Eliot, Fitzgerald was working more with rhythms, with the sounds of language and other formal considerations, than with a conceptual scaffolding such as I am erecting here. As a novelist, though, Conrad opens a new set of concerns, directing us beyond the stylistic and idiomatic considerations that we have thus far entertained. Conrad was, of course, a poetical novelist, and Eliot was at times a novelistic poet. But it was in the modeling of an ambiguous character, of a protagonist who would recreate himself in his own image, not God's, that Conrad gave Fitzgerald what he needed. Out of the cloth of Mr. Kurtz, Fitzgerald cut the suits of J. Gatsby. In order to approach this creative intersection in Fitzgerald's mind between Kurtz and Gatsby, let us first briefly consider the intersection between Charlie Marlowe and Nick Carraway. Both narrators are secondary characters in the story they tell, and each clings to the moral high ground in relation to his protagonist and to the world of his protagonist, be it the Africa of Marlowe or the America of Gatsby. By the end of both novels, the association between the narrator and the lead character thickens like the light in Macbeth. The narrators are possessed by ghosts of the dead, and it is a deep possession. Where this leads me in concluding this short paper is to suggest that Kurtz and Carraway are the sites of conflict between style and substance, as between aesthetics and ethics. Gatsby has an ersatz, Gnostic imagination, and Kurtz has a Nietzschean one. But these heretical, immoral imaginations are profoundly inseparable from the geniuses of their creators. These characters exist to help solve or work out the peculiar set of psychological problems that emerged in Western culture when the moral and the aesthetic, the good and the beautiful, went their separate ways. It is a modern version of the medieval psychomachia between one's good and one's bad angel. We see it in Dr. Faustus. The modern version of the problem touches such well-known names as Kant and Coleridge. It is already flourishing in Keats, whose Belle Dame sans Merci is an ancestor both of Eliot's Belladonna and of Fitzgerald's Daisy Fay. For now, I will have to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. And may I now go to the fourth of our speakers, Professor Tredell.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the three previous speakers for many fascinating areas and avenues and anticipations of certain points I was going to make. I'm going to work on the assumption that The Great Gatsby is a great American novel, that it's a great modern novel, and that it's a great novel, period. And I'll look at certain aspects of it which I think contribute to that greatness, though what I'm going to mention isn't exclusive. There is much more that could be said. First of all, I'd like to focus on the way in which Gatsby combines a romantic and modernist sensibility and style. These are not always fused together in a unity. They are sometimes in a creative tension. They split apart, but he does bring them together in a very exciting and somewhat risky way. And I'll begin by focusing on the passage that Bill, in fact, quoted, the journey over the Queensborough Bridge. But I'm going to start a little earlier in that passage with the very first sentence, although it's actually not quite a sentence because it doesn't have a main subject or verb. And it runs like this: over the great bridge, with the sunlight through the girders, making a constant flicker upon the moving cars, with the city rising up across the river in white heaps and sugar lumps, all built with a wish out of non-olfactory money. The city seen from the Queensborough Bridge is always the city seen for the first time in its first wild promise of all the mystery and the beauty in the world. Now, whenever I read that sentence, I find myself thinking, how did he get away with that? How did a writer who wants to produce cutting-edge modernist work achieve that sentence? Because it uses the kinds of terms that Ezra Pound, for example, in his Few Notes for an Imagiste, said that modern poets, but it would also apply to modern prose writers, shouldn't use. Words like mystery and beauty and wild and promise. Why shouldn't they use them? Because they were seen as too general, too vague, too inflated and redolent of a romantic vocabulary that had become hopelessly outworn. It should be cut out, but in fact, those kinds of nouns and adjectives are very important to Fitzgerald. Take, for example, the adjective gorgeous that is applied to Gatsby more than once. Take the adjective ecstatic with its erotic and religious connotations, which is applied, for example, in a remarkable fusion with a slang phrase. After Nick says goodbye for the last time to Gatsby, and you'll recall the rather poignant scene where he turns to Gatsby and says, "They're a running crowd, you're worth the whole damn bunch put together." And Gatsby smiles as if we had been in ecstatic cahoots on that fact all the time. And then there is, of course, the term, which has been quoted on several occasions, quite rightly, the noun wonder, very important in that vision of the first astonishment of the Dutch settlers arriving on the island. Very important in Gatsby's own sense of wonder, as Nick surmised, is that it must be when he glimpses the green light at the end of Daisy's dock for the first time. Very important when Gatsby and Daisy meet after nearly 5 years, the term wonder is used again there. So Fitzgerald wants to use these terms. He wants to get them in rather than simply excluding them in the kind of cutting edge, hard-edged aesthetic that Ezra Pound and other modernist writers endorsed. what he does is to fuse those kinds of terms with a great awareness and aliveness to the surfaces and the passing phenomena, the fleeting moments of modern existence. And we can see that if we go back to that Queensborough Bridge passage and look at that first opening sentence, or not quite sentence of it, over the great bridge with the sunlight through the girders making a constant flicker upon the moving cars, with a city rising up across the river in white heaps and sugar lumps, all built to the wish out of non-olfactory money. You have the natural force, again very important in Gatsby, of the sunlight, but then you have the girders of the bridge, the steel girders that are cutting the light into geometric shapes, and the light is making a constant flicker upon that very modern form of transport at this time, the cars, the automobile. Now that phrase, constant flicker, is used in the previous chapter when Nick is talking about the racy, exciting feel of New York at night, and what he calls the satisfaction, the constant flicker of men and women and machines gives to the restless eye. Now, in another kind of perspective, a certain kind of writing about the city, this could be seen as very discombobulating, disconcerting, causing ocular and psychological discomfort, that constant flicker, which we might, of course, associate with the movies. But Nick, and Fitzgerald himself through it, doesn't quite see it in that way. He recognizes that it is exciting. He sees something positive in this modernity. He sees in that modernity not just degradation, but the possibilities of wonder. And this is a key difference with T.S. Eliot and The Wasteland. And it's worth, I think, emphasizing that the admiration between them was reciprocal and it was mutual. Eliot wrote to Fitzgerald after Fitzgerald had sent him a copy of The Great Gatsby, and he said, "I have read it 3 times, and it seems to me the first step forward that American fiction has taken since Henry James." Now, as far as I know, he never expanded upon this, so it makes it one of the most tantalizing pieces of unwritten literary criticism of the 20th century. But it does show that Eliot did admire elements of The Great Gatsby, and maybe he saw things in it that he couldn't quite encompass himself. And what I would suggest this lies, for example, in that vision of the city, because the vision of evening in the wasteland, the evening hour that strives, is a wholly negative one. It sees human beings as in the grip of automaticity, when the human engine waits like a taxi throbbing, waiting. And this is seen as a form of death. When Fitzgerald writes about the taxis in New York throbbing in the dark lanes of the 50s as people make their way to the theatre, there's an excitement there. And this is the case throughout The Great Gatsby. You have that romantic vocabulary, but you do have an excitement in all the kinds of aspects of modern life that he observes, from the architecture, the white buildings, from the automobiles, from the telephone. Doubtless he would have been very interested too, had he lived long enough, in social media. And so that's a key element in Gatsby, which is also, I would argue, it's a dangerous generalization perhaps, but it's also an American element. America was here first, at the cutting edge of this kind of urban existence. So he brings those two together. The other elements that Fitzgerald brings together in The Great Gatsby is narrative and a fascination with the intense moment. Now, there is one tendency in modernist writing to focus on that intense moment. You find it in Proust, you find it in Joyce's Ulysses. And what happens there is the moment tends to balloon out, and it tends to arrest or disrupt or slow down the narrative. That isn't a fault, it's what they're doing, it's their aesthetic, it's very effective in his way. But Fitzgerald, one senses, likes telling stories. He likes telling anything from the anecdote to the national epic. And in a sense, in The Great Gatsby, he tries to get in both. He tries to get in both inconsequential anecdotes and to build up towards a national epic. one of his original titles for The Great Gatsby, because The Great Gatsby was a title apparently he never himself liked. And the last one he got very excited about, and he even sent a cable to Maxwell Perkins asking if it could be changed, although by then it was too late, was Under the Red, White and Blue. Now you feel that would have hardly helped the sales of the novel than the catchily alliterative The Great Gatsby. But it relates, first of all, in terms of the present action of the novel in 1922, to when Jordan is looking back to 1917, and she's walking in front of the houses in October 1917 in Louisville, and she sees the banners, the flags in the front of the houses, and they seem to be tutting disapprovingly at her because of the new plaid skirt she is wearing. She's being rather irreverent at that point, but nonetheless, what it conveys is that sense of patriotic fervor at the time the USA enters the war, a clear moment of the definition of national identity. And calling the novel Under the Red, White and Blue would have flagged up, perhaps rather too explicitly, that kind of meaning. As it is, of course, the moment at which is promoted into a national epic is the moment, and Lee quoted much of this at the end of the novel, where it goes back to the Dutch settlers first arriving in America. And of course, there is a great ambivalence there. So you have that storytelling aspect of The Great Gatsby. You also have this fascination with the intense discontinuous moment. What James Joyce, for example, who, like Fitzgerald, was a lapsed, or to use Joyce's pun, a perhaps Catholic, would have seen in its original religious terms, to some extent, there would be that numinous kind of quality in that kind of experience. And what if you go further back? If you go back to the Romantics, Wordsworth called spots of time. When you have modernist writing, and you have that fascination with the epiphany, that focus on the spot of time, the danger is always going to be that it will disrupt the narrative. But as we said, Fitzgerald likes narrative. He likes to tell stories. He was a superlatively successful short story writer, of course. How he does it is essentially by a technique of selection and compression. It's by leaving a lot out and only focusing on what are seen as absolutely key moments. And that enables the narrative not to proceed in a chronologically straightforward way, because as Bill said, there are all kinds of chronological shifts going on, but nonetheless to keep up that kind of narrative drive that Fitzgerald continued to value. And so what you have, if, as people who are studying The Great Gatsby or writing about it usually do at some point, if you try to put Gatsby back into chronological order, you will find there are a large number of gaps, the kind you might expect in a modernist text. So I think that these are two of many great achievements for which The Great Gatsby is notable. This fusion of a romantic and a modernist sensibility and style, not a complete fusion, a lot of creative tension remains, and this fusion of narrative and the intense, discontinuous moment which he can incomparably evoke through his style. Thank you.
And thank you so much. Thank you all. Now I am going to go to the questions, and I will start in chronological order. From James Muller, this is early on, I think in response to the first two. Does the hostility to greatness in current fashion detract from interpreters' ability to appreciate the significance of literary works that explore greatness? Does Fitzgerald present what he considers greatness? Does he criticize it? And I think this is directed, I think, particularly to our first two speakers, but to all of you, any question, to all.
Well, I'm happy to come in. I mean, it's a big question, right? And greatness itself is a big topic. We could spend the entire thing, thinking about that. And I wouldn't say we're certainly not. I don't speak for myself. I'm not hostile to greatness. I'm all for it when it can be achieved and when it can be identified. I think that we're expressing, at least speaking for myself, and as I heard Bill, to be talking about it, expressing some reservations about our assumptions about what constitutes greatness and how that's defined and what exactly it's, is a big term. What exactly do we mean by it? In terms of how it functions in this particular novel, I would say that the question of whether Fitzgerald presents what he considers greatness is one of the kind of animating questions that drives the book. I mean, how we think about that title is a kind of fundamental question. For me, it's a deeply ironic title, and I mean that in the classical sense of ironic, in that it means both, not either or. So not ironic in the sense of sarcastic, which means not what it purports to be, but ironic in the sense that it is both at the same time. And Gatsby the novel makes clear that there are many ways in which Gatsby is great or has the potential to be great, or there are things to admire about Gatsby. And then there are very many, very important ways in which he is very far from great indeed. And also I think that irony, there's another valence to that irony, which I think is important for us to capture, which is and it comes to the point about his uncertainty about the title. But we know from some of the other possibilities that he considered that one of the things he wanted to get at was this idea of Gatsby as a kind of tawdry showman, as a kind of carnival barker, huckster, magician, the Great Gatsby, And so I think you have to hear it in that way as well, in this kind of sense that he thinks he's putting on a show that he's not quite pulling off, and that people are seeing beyond. So greatness, Fitzgerald is playing deliberately and turning around ideas of greatness and interrogating whether greatness can exist in the American society of the 1920s, specifically and more broadly in American society as it has evolved. And then he's asking a more universal question about what human greatness might look like, and can we create a society in which greatness can be realized? And he's asking a question about what artistic greatness looks like, what literary greatness looks like, and the ending again comes back to that. The fact that, when that famous line when he says, that man came face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate for his capacity for wonder. But what he says is that he was in the grasp of that's not quite the right word, but of an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired. So this idea that we may encounter greatness and then reject it, and that's of course the Chapman's Homer point that Lee was getting at, that we can be so awestruck that we don't understand it, but does that mean that greatness is going to pass us by, or are we going to register it and not know what to do with it? So he's asking lots and lots of questions about what happens if greatness comes into our ken, and what do we do with it?
Sorry, perhaps just to develop that further. Thank you, Sarah. That was usefully complex.
Sorry, I didn't mean that to be the last word.
It was usefully complex, and absolutely so. I think one of the things that makes that difficult term is in the novel itself is because Nick Carraway, our narrator, makes it difficult, because he's experiencing that first side of things, more than the sarcastic side of greatness, when Gatsby showing him his medal from Little Montenegro on the Adriatic Sea, down on the Adriatic Sea, and then Nick goes through this hyperbole. Oh, I must have really showed me all the rubies of the Raj and other things, and he just doesn't believe this, even though there's some evidence here with the medal itself. But Nick goes through a transformation in the course of the novel, and I think it's partly the transformation is internal as much as recognizing something in Gatsby about that, whether it's the aspiration or the ability to imagine something beyond yourself. And I think Nick is saying too, beyond my kind of comfortable upper middle class background, beyond the class of people that I'm a part of that culture, that I can transcend that training too. I can transcend what America is, has been. And in relation to what Nicolas was saying, modernism isn't just about, the form and technique of literature. America, as Gertrude Stein and others say, is the place of the modern. And that could also mean social transformation, cultural transformation too. I think Nick is then going back to those, is there a source of that ideals, or was it always corrupted from the very beginning? Is there a chance that we can make it new and make it better? And he's thinking of himself as well. I think starting with himself, really.
And our other two panelists, do either of you want to answer this question too?
Well, I do think it is, as Sarah said, it's a very complicated kind of question. And there's this curious division in Nick that he wants to say Gatsby is so much better, but he also says, well, I disapproved of him from beginning to end. And there always seems to be this tension there. So it may be in relation to what Bill said, that Nick, in fact, doesn't quite achieve that kind of transcendence. He doesn't reset himself with no goals. He goes back home, maybe he marries the tennis girl with the sweaty upper lip, and he just seems to settle back into that. So there's a sense of that the aspiration to greatness, the aspiration to transcendence is worth pursuing, but inevitably doomed. And to some extent that goes right back to the early romantics, of course, and the sense that the greatness or the intense perception, Wordsworth's glory and the freshness of a dream, is always in the past. But one of the things that America does, of course, and American romanticism, is to say, no, we can take this forward. It doesn't have to be in the past. It can be in the present. And I'm not sure that the novel quite comes down on that more positive note, if you like, because again it's set back in the past and it becomes universalized at the end. So we, not just Americans, but so we beat on boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. So the thrusting forward, particularly perhaps associated in global history with American civilization, is finally goes back to a cyclical kind of eternal return kind of approach. I think it's very interesting in that way. You get that forward thrust of linear forward going time and the sense of a cyclical time.
In Gatsby, we talked about Nietzsche briefly. I think Sarah brought a few philosophers up, and we've talked about Emerson as well. But I think Nietzsche, that a sense of eternal return is important, I think, for how we can see part of the novel. It's not easy, but that the past isn't really ever lost. It's just can never be left behind. It's got its complications too. It's got its difficulties, but an idea behind it can be a basis for something that can at least have the potential for change.
I'm going to intrude with a question of my own. How much is it a great New York City novel and a great Midwestern novel on its way to becoming a great American novel? And the way I sort of think of this is the New York City novels about people coming from everywhere, and the Midwestern novels about people leaving for somewhere else. And it would seem to me it has both of those. Is its Americanness, its modernity, the way that it incorporates the regional traditions and fuses them? And this, by the way, this is the great stepbrother to the Willa Cather novels bit as well, that he gleefully and acknowledgedly is in her debt.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great idea. It's a fascinating idea, in fact. And of course, there is a tendency, I think, in my own approach, I suppose, and there's a lot of criticism to emphasize the New York of the West all along towards the end. And you get that marvelous lyrical description of them returning home in their vacations and feeling a kind of oneness with the country that they don't, in fact, seem to feel in New York in the same kind of way. And I guess there's a sense, I sometimes do it alongside Main Street and Sinclair Lewis and that kind of exploration of that kind of America. This might
whether it's a great New York or a great Long Island novel, I'm not quite sure how we make the distinction there, but we can see it too in the sense that what Ken Sir was talking about, how this fits into the ego of Fitzgerald to create a great novel. That he was doing that from the previous novel too, with Beautiful and Damned, because he's saying at least that no one can write better than I can in America at the moment. And he says that to his editor, and he has to believe that, I think, to achieve those goals. But then what is he doing with those regions? And also remember, Gatsby has traveled a bit as well, with Dan Cody, and funny part about San Francisco being from the Midwest. Well, in a sense, he has. You travel from the Midwest to the high seas and get to San Francisco, and but also the novel is not it's not a Henry James novel. It's not going to be about the international theme between Europe and America anymore, only in the sense that the war is still there. That's never depicted, but it's certainly omnipresent in the minds of our two male protagonists. But it's a novel about America because it also then can only just go from East Coast to the Midwest. It can do the Europe East Coast that James is doing. Instead, it does it within the United States borders, and it's declaring this is the start of a new era in American literature, when American literature will become world literature. And that was part of that aspiration that he was seeking, and what he did within those borders, the U.S. borders.
Anyone else on that? If not, I'll go to the next question, which is, Jay Jones, do any of you think there's been a definitive film or television adaptation yet? If so, what version? If not, what's the challenge? And I must say that it is actually, it's wonderful. I mean, how the visual, imagination really matters for, does it understand properly the Fitzgerald's mind? Can you fully adapt a novel to the visual format? What is lost and what is gained, inevitably in a transformation of the visual genres and in any particular one. That's all foo-for-raw I'm adding. So what's your answers? Is there the definitive adaptation?
I don't think there's a definitive film adaptation. We don't, of course, have the 1926 silent film, but from what one reads about it, I guess that's not. As I mentioned, in fact, and this is perhaps more than merely anecdotal, the first encounter I had with The Great Gatsby was the 1949 film with Alan Ladd, and he's always stayed in my mind as a rather good Gatsby because of his mixture of physical fragility and toughness, like in the gangster roles he played previously, as in A Gun for Sale, for example. And then, of course, the Redford one, which is there was an interesting comment, which you may well know, that Howard de Silva was in both films. He was in the 1949 film and the 74 Redford film, and he played I think it was George Wilson in the first and Wolfsheim in the other. And he made a very interesting comment. He said that Ladd had actually taken him, when he'd been working with that, he'd taken him to the rooms he was inhabiting. He pulled open the wardrobe door and showed all his suits and said, "Not bad for an Okie." And what De Silva said was that Ladd could convincingly play someone from the other side of the tracks, like Gatsby, that Redford, though a fine actor, coming from a more privileged background, couldn't. And I always thought that was interesting. I'd also just like briefly to mention, because it may not be so well known, the Toby Stevens film with Toby Stevens, a British actor, of course, so with quite a good American accent, in the role of Gatsby. The Baz Luhrmann film is something else again, which we could all talk about a lot, I expect, but I'll stop at that point.
I've always liked the Alan Ladd 1940s version because it doesn't even try to follow the plot of the Great Gatsby. It becomes an interesting gangster film in itself.
Yes.
I didn't, there's certain, you can adapt this novel. There's no, what do you mean by definitive? It's hard to say, but an adaptation is going to meet some of the needs of its time, each of those eras. And I think the 70s, with the way that it starts, coming in from the ocean and Sam Waterston's narration, I think that works pretty well. And then also, I didn't like much of the Baz Luhrmann film, I have to say, because you can hear the Fitzgerald scholar, you can hear all the echoes from dialogue from the letters and other things, and it's not really from the novel itself as such. But the way that it actually did have that, again, for a film, to incorporated as Nick Carraway, now in a, under care.
Yeah,
in a
yeah.
mental asylum. And
Yeah.
again, coming to terms with what's happened to him. And I thought that actually framework worked well for me.
Yes, I agree. I thought that was a perfectly reasonable extrapolation. Yeah.
I'd like to add a couple of points that, if I may, and from a straight woman's perspective on the film versions. The problem with the Redford film, and I have said this to a lot of women and a lot of gay men, and I have never had one of them disagree with me, is that nobody, and I mean nobody, leaves Robert Redford for Bruce Dern. Like, it just doesn't happen. So it's an absolutely no, but it's a joke, but it's not a joke, because it's a core piece of miscasting in it. I mean, Bruce Dern is not powerful, he's not intimidating, and you just don't leave Robert Redford for him. Like, it doesn't work, right? So, and I think that in combination with that is that I would say that Redford's privilege is one thing, but I mean, DiCaprio has privilege, but I agree that he actually plays, I think he plays Gatsby fairly well, and he managed to show those cracks in the facade. But Redford's self-regard is so total that he won't do that. And so there is no crack in the facade there. So for me, that just lets the film down. It has lots of things to enjoy, but the kind of central power dynamics and the ideas of who these characters are, I think it just, for me, it fundamentally gets wrong. But I'll come back to the kind of central point that I was making in my remarks, which is that I do think it's a story about the relationship of the real to the ideal. Fitzgerald tells us that it's about being the platonic conception of yourself, and then how that fails. But I think that it's also fundamentally about the superiority of the imagination, and so for me, it becomes unfilmable in that regard. There are aspects of it, of course, that are filmable and that can be done beautifully, and it can bring all of its social history to life, and lots of that stuff can be brought to life. But that key aspect of it, and then Fitzgerald's poetry, and then the ending, all of that, which are kind of so foundational to its greatness, certainly to its reputation, or to my love of it and my admiration of it as a work of art. I mean, so I agree with I can't remember if it was Remnick. So it was David Remnick. In the New Yorker, I think it was said that the Gatsby is one of those that some works of art achieve their perfect form, and the Gatsby's perfect form is as a novel, and that there are other works that we might see as having a different kind of form. And I like that way of thinking about it, which isn't to say you can't put it into different forms, but that maybe there's a right form for different kinds of works of art and different kinds of questions. And for me, the language is so central to the effects of Gatsby.
Absolutely.
I also mentioned in passing not a film, but you can find a video of the play Gats. And I saw it in London not long after it was starting to tour there. I think it started touring in 2006 in New York. And I thought that was just a fantastic adaptation, because first of all, you heard all of the text, but also the way they set it up, very cleverly in an office, and how other people kind of start to take on, in some ways, like I was saying about Nick Carraway, how he changes his mind about Gatsby, or at least his vision of Gatsby and of himself, and the characters start to become. The characters in the office start to become the characters in the novel as well, and including one character coming in with pink suits, and it worked really, really well, I thought, and it became a whole experience that you could enjoy, both for the text itself, you're hearing it, but also for the way that it was framed as well.
Thank you. I'm going to move to another question by Victor King. I'm always somewhat puzzled that we tend to speak about Gatsby as being a quintessential American in his at first successful striving for status and money. But didn't he forge signatures on bearer bonds to fund his aspirations? So he was not really a businessman in any real sense. He literally stole every dollar he spent. He was a delusional crook, not that it makes the novel less important. And I'm going to push that a little bit. Is Jay Gatz what happened to Huckleberry Finn when he grew up?
Well, I mean, we know biographically what happened to Huckleberry Finn when he grew up, because Mark Twain talks
Yeah.
about what happened to the model of him, and it's worse than what happened to Gatsby in some senses. But look, I think that I would say a couple of things to that. I think that it's not the only way that Gatsby made his money. He also made his money through bootlegging. So we can say that he earned it. Now he earned it criminally, but you know, there were proceeds coming in, as it were. But yes, that's the point, right? The point is that that Gatsby's success can only be achieved, and the ways that he's been encouraged to think about greatness and grandeur is to measure it by wealth, and he can't get the wealth honestly, or at least not fast enough, and not at the grandiose scale that he thinks he needs it to impress Daisy. And so he is corrupted by America into these choices. So I think that, you know, that going back to my point about the irony of the greatness of Gatsby is that it's about can what would it be to be a truly great American? And if we have an ironic perspective on that, it would be, this is a quintessential American precisely because he cheats. You know, I mean, there are people have been you know, since Trump's rise in 2016, people have been making, in my view, often very, very skewed analogies to Trumpism and the figures in Gatsby, but without wanting to get into analogies about individual characters, because that could take us all night to kind of parse out. I would say that the world that Fitzgerald figures there, what he calls the kind of spectroscopic gaiety of a world in which people have no consciousness of limits beyond themselves and of standards beyond their own standards, is and that corruption is kind of fine, and vulgarity is fine, and that kind of whole world of West Egg, which has all of the raw vigor that he associates with America, but is also totally, you know, as I say, it's kind of embracing corruption. I think a lot of people would say that is quintessentially American, and that's kind of I think in one sense we can say that's kind of the point.
And perhaps we're okay with that kind of success if it works, and you can be, you know, like the Kennedys, for example, from a bootlegging past, and if it fits in, I suppose, to a kind of social acceptance over time, then it works. But Gatsby wants it now, and that becomes his downfall.
And there is a kind of overlap between these criminal activities. It's organized crime. So there's kind of overlap to some extent. And I'm not casting aspersions on legitimate businessmen here with business. It's highly organized. Gatsby is running bond fraud and he's running bootlegging on a national scale. He's summoned to the phone time and again. We don't see him committing any actual violence, though no doubt violence is being committed. So it is much more organized crime, like a business. And in that sense, it's an early 20th century phenomenon that I suppose we particularly associate with America and with bootlegging, but you could find elsewhere as well. And again, just going back to the 1949 film in relation to this, what they do at the beginning of that, really before it starts, is a kind of montage which shows Gatsby actually shooting people, having shootouts with fellow gangsters and such like, emphasizing that side of his activity. But that's not, of course, the side that's emphasized in the novel. It's the organized business-like side of being called to the phone, having to make lots of decisions, being derisive of someone who thinks Detroit is a small town, that kind of thing. So again, it's a 20th century phenomenon.
I think the Black Sox is a revelation. You know, talk about American Boyhood. There's another Robert Redford moment with his film version of The Natural. But to take that American boyhood dream and corrupt it. And then we have to remember, not only is Nick kind of astonished by this, but Wolfsheim is rather creative in it. So there you sense this tension that I was talking about in my paper between the ethical and the aesthetic, between morality and creation. So yes, I mean, the question, the guy's got a real point. There's a great deal of crookedness afoot here.
There's also a point, thinking of the Black Sox scandal, that Nick is astounded that it's one person that could be responsible for it. And it's not something that just happens from the deep underbelly, dark underbelly of America. It's actually one person, and I think that's the connection with that Gatsby too. This a person can actually achieve something like that. And obviously,
Sort of a dark Emerson, that wonderful couplet by Eliot. The shadow of a man is history, said Emerson, who hadn't seen the silhouette of Sweeney straddled in the sun. And Sweeney is the new American man. So it's a rather dark shadow.
Thank you. I'm actually going to suddenly interrupt because we're roughly at the end of the time scheduled for our webinar, but it's wonderful to have an Emerson quotation as the conclusion to our discussion of Fitzgerald. I think that rather fits the ambition of this series to cover all of American literature and ideally get the people watching it to connect all the different figures to one another. Thank you. I want to say thank you first to our panelists. Thank you all for wonderful presentations. Delighted and grateful to have you speak. I want to say thank you to the audience. This is for you and your questions make it possible. So we can't do it without you, we do it for you. I want to repeat to everyone, if your question didn't get answered and you want to send it again and get it answered, please send it to me. Randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org, and I will be delighted to forward it on to our panelists so they can have the option of responding to you. And I want to repeat, this will be available within 24 hours on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. Now, I also want to mention we are continuing our Great American Literature series of webinar series, and indeed our Great American History of Technology series of webinars. These are continuing. It's September 22nd, we're having The Age of Rail, and we're having Catcher in the Rye on September 27th. I believe those are our next two. So encourage you to do that. If you like this and you like what the National Association of Scholars is doing, encourage you to become a member. Always delighted to have you join us for, among other things, supporting events like this. So that's the that's the Barker aspect where I embrace the that aspect of the American dream, I think. Thank you all so very much. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.